I'd like to thank everyone for dialing in today. We're going to read just a bit of information to Dr. Ben Yuhas, and then we'll turn it over to him to begin the presentation. After 10 years in financial services in 2004, Ben took his experience as Senior Director of Database Marketing at Barclaycard US to pioneer the use of individual-level data in politics. In 2008, he served in the Obama War Room on Election Day, using early results to inform the allocation of get-out-the-vote resources. Today, as principal of the Yuhas Group, Ben helps a variety of commercial and nonprofit clients use data to make better decisions by providing data analytics, segmentation, and predictive modeling. Dr. Yuhas lives in Baltimore with his wife and 2 sons and serves as president of the board for the Ingenuity Project, a private-public partnership in Baltimore's public schools whose mission is to identify and prepare a diverse generation of STEM leaders. And now we'll turn it over to Dr. Ben Yuhas. Thanks so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you can hear me okay. This is building on, I gave a talk to the Society of Applied Math at Hopkins in February, and this is an extension of that work and actually a fair amount of overlap for those of you that were there before. Feel free to interrupt with questions, and I'll get started. So the basic topic we're going to cover is this data-driven campaigns, and it's the use of these electronic voter files and advanced analytic techniques to become ubiquitous. And what these techniques allow people to do is it allows campaigns to target individuals with specific and customized communications. And I want to walk you through both where this came from and how it's evolved over the last few years. So when you think about a campaign, there's really 3 principal activities that they partake in. One is to try to persuade the undecided voter. You know, the person has conflicting issues they're trying to resolve. We're going to try to find that issue that will resonate to deliver that message in a convincing way. Turnout supporters. You know, we all know that a fair number of Americans don't show up to vote. And so if we know where our supporters are, if we can get them to show up, that's half the battle. And then finally, you know, it's a non-trivial amount of campaigns nowadays talk about demoralizing your opposition. You know, talk to those aspects of your opponent that are in direct conflict, perhaps, with the people that are supporting. But once those are the objectives, the question is, how do you do it? What are your tools? So really what the questions that campaigns have to ask are, who should I reach out to? What voter should I go try to talk to? What's the message that's going to be most persuasive to that specific voter? And which channel should I use? Should I try to do it over TV, direct mail, on the web, mobile, Twitter, Facebook, etc.? And there's some constraints around these choices. One is that we all realize all votes are not of equal value. You know, it doesn't necessarily do the Clinton campaign a whole lot of value to generate a few more thousand votes in Maryland, where they're very likely to win. It'd be better off spending those resources in a tightly contested state like North Carolina. And the other thing is that the cost to deliver one additional vote may vary. So in some markets, the cost to be on TV may be so expensive that you're better off spending that money in another state, even though that vote is equally important in both states. So the bottom line all these campaigns have to ask is, where can I spend my dollars to have the biggest impact? So where do we come from? So the classic approach to a campaign is we divide the electorate into 3 groups: us, them, and the swing voters. Within that group, we then, you know, either in the course of an election campaign, we may try to generate some new registrants. They're sporadic voters, people that we know support us but may not show up at every election. We then may use polling to describe the voters. You know, what are our segments where we're doing well. You know, in this particular campaign, you know, Hillary's doing very well with minority populations, with female populations. Donald Trump's doing very well with white males. You also use polling to refine your messages. Try different message tests to see who responds to which message. And then finally, there's this geo-targeting to the message base, the messenger base. So historically in the campaign, I would go to those precincts, those cities, those regions where my reporters live, and I would just blanket them either with TV or with canvassing. And so that's the tactics they're going to use. That's the approach they want to take. And this is sort of a snapshot of the way they'll spend those resources in this cycle. So more than half of your dollars will be spent on broadcast TV or cable TV, and it's a relatively small amount. Even though we have a lot of data-driven campaigning, most of it is still large broadcast TV. But things are changing. And why are things changing? There's sort of two big drivers of change. One, TV ads are much less effective than they used to be. Part of that's because of DVRs. People skip over ads. Another reason of that is the increased fragmentation. It used to be, 30, 40 years ago, there was 3 networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC, and if you bought ads on those, you were reaching the majority of the population. Now people are split, and people tend to, there's this whole echo chamber where people that tend to agree with Fox News tend to watch Fox News, people that watch NBC and MSNBC. So trying to find people that are undecided, or they're all over the spectrum of channels. The other thing that's really changed is there are fewer classic swing voters. We tend to start off an election cycle with almost 80 to 90% of the electorate firmly in the Republican or the Democratic camp. So if you're using broadcast TV, you're only and to try to persuade voters to vote for you. You're wasting a lot of your resources, because 90% of the people you're talking to in a broadcast TV may in fact already be a decided voter. So this is just to show you a little tidbit this year of how the whole concept of TV drives success is sort of been turned on its head. If you look at this, Sanders significantly outspent Clinton on TV ads through May, and Trump was soundly outspent by Rubio, Bush, and Cruz, and even Kasich on TV. So, just having the most TV ads is no longer a guarantee that that's going to get you over the finish line. So, how is the role of data in politics in the face of this eval? Well, polling's been around forever. It started in the 1930s, and most polling up until the last few cycles has been really focused on just random digit dialing. They, if they're in an area code 410 for the Baltimore region, they'll just sort of randomly dial households and try to think that that's a representative sample of the electorate. That really changed after 2000. 2000 is Gore v. Bush, where there was a lot of concern that people, the voter files were not accurately. A lot of them were literally paper-based at the time, and when people showed up to vote, for example, in Florida, people weren't on those lists. And so after that, the Congress passed the Help America Vote Act of 2002, where they mandated electronic voter files. Once these electronic voter files were created, an entire industry grew up around the use of those voter files. So there are multiple vendors, Catalyst and TargetSmart being the most prominent on the progressive side, which took these voter files and then augmented them with literally hundreds of variables, from census variables, demographics, home ownership, car ownership, you name it. These voter files are massive. So all of a sudden you have this new repository of information that keeps track of voters at the individual level. That allows you to now, instead of targeting geographies, instead of looking at the voting results from the last election and just focusing on those areas where you did well, you can now target individuals in individual households regardless of where they live in the state geographically. And finally, the last thing that I'll talk about at the end here is that experimentation. Experimentation is something that's been done in the commercial side of the house for years. When I worked in the credit card space, we would often be, when we send out a solicitation or an offer of credit in direct mail campaigns, we would often have 3 or 4 different packages, 3 or 4 different creatives, 3 or 4 different messages that we would test to see which one worked best. And now we're starting to see that same experimentation in politics, because now that we have voter files and keep track of the individuals we contact, and we can keep track of who shows up to vote, we now can do a much better and more accurate job of measuring the impact of our behaviors. So before I proceed, is there any questions, or I will just keep plugging along? Okay. So let me just walk through the process of the way this modeling tends to work in a campaign. First step is a focus group. This is not particularly heavy in data, but it seems to be the precursor for all the campaigns I've seen. Focus groups, they tend to recruit 10 to 20 people, pay them a small stipend, they put them in a conference room, often with either a camera or a one-way mirror, and they ask the moderator to lead a discussion. What's good about these focus groups is they allow people to sort of discuss these in their own language, and they're allowed to sort of raise their own issues. In a poll, a lot of those things are well defined, so if there's something that's of burning concern to the electorate, it may get missed if it was not thought of a priority. They also allow, now the minuses is these are really small groups, so you don't have a lot of statistical accuracy, really small sample sizes, 10 to 20, and also you get very odd group dynamics. I've seen where, you may have a very strong personality room that will pretty much, dominate the conversation and start to steer people away or intimidate people from saying what they think. Down at the bottom, the quad graph there is sort of the 4 topics that we tend to cover in a focus group. We want to know what they say about us. So in this campaign, Clinton's being portrayed as corrupt and too liberal, and they want to know what they say about themselves. So the agent of change, successful businessman. And conversely, we also want to know, sort of start to feel what we can say about us, what seems to resonate with these voters. We're the middle class, we're experienced, and then what we say about them, that they're dangerous and only for the rich. So those are the sort of just getting the general framework of the messaging in the focus groups. Again, not very accurate in terms of sample sizes, but it's just trying to develop some potential languages. The output of this, what you hope to do is end up with what's called a sort of an issue salience map. And it's sort of along the x-axis here, we're trying to identify what's important to the electorate. So the highest issue on this particular graph is jobs. And then we also want to sort of understand in the minds of the electorate, do we have an advantage on this or a disadvantage? So, again, looking just from a perspective of progressive, while taxes may be important to people, it's a disadvantage for us. We're perceived as being, even more likely to raise taxes. Where we're much more likely have an advantage on the issue of Social Security that will protect Social Security. So the whole point of, again, the focus groups is just to come up with what are the things we want to test. And polling is where we start to sort of actually ramp up in terms of data and start to test these messages in the field. So polling serves multiple purposes. First one that we're all aware of, the one that we see on TV every day, is to predict the outcome of the election. The important thing there is that you want to talk to everybody in the electorate to predict the outcome of the election. So that's one objective of polling. The next one is when you get back the results, you can start to define broad segments. So you'll hear things like, in some elections, there's things like soccer moms, or you'll hear in the electorate this cycle, you hear the press talk about, non-college white males or college-educated females and all those things. So there's these sort of broad segments that they want to talk to and then describe. The third is to start to test messages from the focus group. So as I mentioned in the last thing, if the focus group says that they find somebody's temperament is not suited for president, if we actually test that in a poll, if we read some scripts that use that as an argument, do we see people move? Do we see people who are sitting on the fence tend to move away from us or toward us? And which particular segment seems to be more moved by that? And then based on both the segments we've defined and how the messages play in those different segments, we may start to have targets. So we're going to talk to, we may talk to, young females one way because this message seems to resonate. So the polling process is really straightforward. You do a survey design. What's the questions and the sequence of questions I want to ask? You obtain your polling sample. Now remember, traditionally polling samples were just random digit dialing, just dialed landlines in random. Now we can be much more specific. Because we have a voter file, we can pull things out and have a very specific distribution geographically, demographically, vote history. We can get channel-specific contact information from the voter file, so we can either reach out to them through the web or through the phone or direct mail. And then we can also specify the quantity of the polling sample. Obviously, larger quantity gives us more accurate, but it's also a lot more expensive. Once we have the polling sample, we have the survey. Execution takes place in the field. This can be done live. IVR, those automated polls you may get, are now increasingly online. And then we do some analysis in the back end. Polling has some specific challenges, though. One is landlines are disappearing. I think last date I saw from 2012, almost half of the homes in the U.S. no longer even have a landline. And for voters between the ages of 25 to 29, it's less than a third. So, and many of these polls cannot be done, especially the automated ones cannot be done, for example, to a cell line. So landlines are disappearing. We need to be much more, which means we have to use live surveys only to cellular, and we make sure that those are in the mix when we make a call. Second, completion rates are dropping. Even when we reach somebody, people are much more likely to just hang up halfway through the survey. So, and these things are not just, these things tend not to be random. They tend to be very correlated with support. So for example, if your candidate tends to be winning and tends to be up in the polls, those people that support it are much more likely to stay on the phone and answer your questions. So it sort of increases the bias of your response. Whereas if candidate's getting, losing and falling behind the polls, there's a general disgust or general lack of enthusiasm, and they're much more likely to drop off the poll. And the third thing I just want to touch on briefly is the impact of order and wording of questions is huge in terms of response. And I pulled this example from a Pew Research study from 2003. They were talking about some polls were asking whether they would favor opposing taking military action in Iraq. And if it was asked just to simply, would you be favor opposed to take action to end Saddam Hussein's rule, and you could get a 68% that they would favor military action. If you instead ask the question, would you oppose or support take military action to end Saddam Hussein's rule, even if it meant the U.S. forces may suffer thousands of casualties, it drops to 43. So you'll often hear numbers quoted in the press that the war had X number percent support, and it's very easy, depending upon which question you choose here, whether or not you can completely misrepresent what the underlying electorate says. So whenever you hear something like that, it's important. And nowadays, more and more, they're showing you the full text of the question online, but it's worth looking at because it's really can completely change. So it's one of the things that we try really hard when we design surveys is to make the question as neutral as possible, to try to not sway people. Next thing I want to do, this was an interesting article, it was in the New York Times a couple weeks ago, is that the polling dilemma is that in this particular case, they gave the poll results from 867 poll responses to 5 different pollsters. And you can see the results that they interpreted the exact same data. So now we're looking at the same survey, the same answers, the same number of people. And the reason this is so different is, given a bunch of responses, the pollster has to guess. The pollster has to make an educated guess who's going to show up. So if I think males are going to turn out in a greater rate than normal this elective, then I'm going to weight the male responses. Or if I think the minorities are going to turn out, then you can weight minority populations. And so I wanted to spend a couple of slides here showing you how much this varies and how this drives the entire results in polling, and why polling is while it can be very scientific in terms of design and sample collecting, the weighting, how much you take into account each individual response, is very much an art. So take a look at this triangle, because this is going to be the basis of the next few slides. So at the end of the cycle, you're going to end up in one corner. You're either going to vote for a Democrat in the upper left-hand corner, you're going to vote for a Republican in the upper right-hand corner, or you're not going to vote at all. And I apologize for your third-party supporters. This is just a simplification for the purposes of this conversation. So let's look at the electorate, how it changed from 2008 to 2012. So here, if you think about the x-axis here, that's the total vote. It's slightly blue, so we know in 2008 the Democrats did better. Obama was elected, and the turnout was fairly high. Now, if I look at how from 2008 to 2010, let's see how it changed. It moved down. Fewer people showed up. There was more non-voters, and it moved right. It became more red. And so what's the result of that? Well, in 2010, the Democrats lost 63 seats. The Republicans picked up 63 seats in the Congress, and which was the largest pickup since 1938. And the Republicans picked up 6 Senate seats. So we can also look at this by subgroup. group. So here it is by ethnicity. Again, you'll see up in the upper left hand, African Americans tended to turn out even higher than the white population in this particular race. There's a lot of enthusiasm with Obama on the top of the ticket, and they were overwhelmingly Democratic. Now in 2010, what happened? Well, many of the minority population stayed home. The electorate was dominated by white, and it was definitely dominated by Republicans. Same thing with age. You'll see this is 2008, and in 2010, the 18 to 29-year-olds stayed home. Significant. Look at the difference between like the 65 and over. They were almost in parity in 2008 in this slide, and by 2010, the 18 to 29ers dropped almost in half. Income, here's 2008. So you can see there's a big drop-off, a flattening, almost across the board. Not as discriminating as in some of the other groups. Gender, again, a slightly overperforming female in the 2008 race. It was relatively even in 2010. Again, moved from slightly blue to slightly red. And now here, going from 2000 to 2012, 2012 being a president, all the sort of circles jump back up. So what a pollster has to do, given a set of polls, is I have to decide, is the electorate going to look like this, or is it going to look like this, or something in between? And that, depending upon how much I weight those, is going to give me a completely different answer in terms of my expected turnout. So that's it for polls. I want to move on. So now we have modeling voter behavior. And what we're going to do here, this is the idea of creating a mathematical model to predict behavior. Much of this has been done in the credit card space. You probably all realize you have a FICO score, which is where credit bureaus try to predict whether or not you're going to be creditworthy. Those same ideas from financial services have been brought over into the voter file. So can I predict a model that's going to predict which candidate you're going to support? Can I predict whether you're going to vote this particular cycle? Can I predict how much important a particular issue is to you? And one thing now exists across, every one of us has one of these scores, and there's literally hundreds of these scores on the voter files. We can use those to target outreach for mobilizing your base. So I know you are not always, your probability of turning out kind of low, but if you do turn out, your likelihood of supporting me is really high. Well, that's what I'm going to target to mobilize my base. Persuading the undecided. I see that you vote almost every election, so your turnout probability is really high, but your candidate support is somewhere in the middle. You seem to be undecided. Maybe that's a place to target your resources to persuade the undecided. And then issue salience. Maybe I know you're currently supporting a particular candidate, but that candidate is perhaps pro-gun control and you're strongly anti-gun control. Maybe I want to talk to you about that candidate's position to make you less enthusiastic to show up to vote for them. Basics of modeling are fairly straightforward. What the whole idea is you're trying to take readily accessible data to predict behavior. So first thing you do is you take that polling data that we did. You use a bunch of polls to identify who are supporters based on polling data. Or I'll go look in the vote history that's available in the voter file and say, who's likely to turn out. Once I have this set of examples, these are the type of people I want to look for, I append all this data from the voter file: demographics, age, gender, presence of children, home value, predicted income. I look at your vote history. The voter files, these publicly available voter files, keep track of every time you show up for a general election or a primary, and it also keeps track of whether you do an early vote or a regular vote. And it also gives me registration data. Did you register in a party? And so once I have sort of people I'm looking for, supporters or likely voters, and I have this data, I basically use statistical modeling, decision trees, regression, or other techniques to find relationships. So what's predictive of being a supporter? What's predictive of being a likely voter? So the national voter files that I'm using, they started off, this is a snapshot of that voter file looks like. So it has about 190 million voter file records, every person that's registered to vote in the country. It also keeps track of vote history. So I keep track of every one of these voter file records has a flag whether or not you showed up for any particular election. It also we also have, from commercial data sources, unregistered adults. So there are programs around that are just focused on registering adults that look like current supporters. So I have a support model that says this person is likely to support me, but he's not registered, or she's not registered. Let's spend some resources to try to register them. And that's been a huge amount of energy around this in this cycle, in particular among Hispanic populations in the Southwest and in Florida. Then they append specialty lists you can purchase and flag people as being doctors. So if there's issues around doctors you want to talk to, you can identify them. We have over 711 million historical data from people I've reached out to contact and how they responded. So if I've done a survey, we keep track of survey data in these voter files. If I've, I've reached out to you to try to turn out to vote, that, how did you respond? So all those different calls keep track. And then, individual clients that use this data also provide specific models. So I talked about turnout and support an issue, but people care about ballot initiatives. There's hundreds of models out there that people have built. So now I want to just briefly walk you through a case study. So this happens to be relevant to Tim Kaine. So this was the first big campaign I worked on. Virginia, 2005. It was for the gubernatorial election of 2006. Kaine began the race and was well behind Kilgore. He started off, I think, polling at around 32% in April. So the traditional way you would go to try to find people, I would go to precincts where in the past 65% of them have voted for a Democrat. That would be a set of precincts I would go target, knock on doors, try to get those people to go out to vote. I'm going to be knocking on 35% of the doors. I'm going to be knocking on maybe not be supporters, but hopefully if I can turn people out, I'm going to be turning out nearly 2-to-1 people favors. In other states, you might use party registration. Let's just go talk to all the Democrats and get them to vote. Well, Virginia is a state that doesn't do party registration. So what we needed to do for them is to find a new way to find their supporters. So we started off with a random poll, about 10,000, and we defined our dependents. You'll see down there a list of Kaine. Those are the people we want to find, people that look like them. We then appended all these independent variables from the commercial voter file. And it goes through, using these techniques, it says, what are the variables that are most predictive of being Kaine supporter? In this particular play example, it's saying, having participated in primary 2000 and 2004, your gender, your marital status, and whether you live in a multi-unit dwelling. And also if you live in a census block, which tends to be African-American or black. Once I say these variables are important, I give them different weights, and I can generate a score, shown over there in the far right column, the pink column. I can then sort the voter file by the score and identify my most likely supporter and my least likely supporter. So what does that look like when we put it all together? Well, if I take the entire voter file and I sort it, and I break it up into 10 equal bins, and then I do a poll of a sample with each one of these bins, this is what we found. So people that had a support score of 10 was almost supporting Kaine at 70%. People that had a support score of 1 supported him at less than 10%, and undecided voter. Given that our baseline, given that if we just had called people at random, would have given us only 32%, we're getting a real improvement in terms of an efficiency. Now if we focus on 9 and 10, we're going to spend a lot more productive time, less resources finding more supporters. How does that translate on the ground? Well, at the state level, what I'm showing you here is darker blue is where if we just take people in those top two, 9s and 10, the top 20%, top 2 deciles, where do they distribute? You can see in these dark, so you see they distribute around Washington, D.C., around Richmond, around the Newport News, Chesapeake, Virginia Beach area. Larger urban areas, sort of typical Democratic support base. But we can actually drill down in a county like Loudoun County. Loudoun County has always been a contested battleground county, and now all of a sudden we could drill down and look at where they distribute. Obviously darker blue around Leesburg, but even within that, we now have, because we have a voter file, we actually can give a list of individual names. We can flag them down to individual roads, and actually down to individual addresses. This becomes useful not only for direct mail and calling people, but actually when you go out to canvass, when you actually go out to knock on doors. One of the things we heard back from the campaign when we build these models is there was people down in Tidewater, down in the south east part of the state, who had never had a canvasser knock on the doors. These Democrats lived in relatively red areas, and so they were shocked when we actually sent people to knock on their doors because there was enough of a concentration to make it worthwhile. So the other result of having these scores is that we expanded the playing field. If you just look at the number of targets by county, if you looked at targets and just define them as people that lived in a precinct that had 65% or more votes for Democrats in the past, you can see the dark green how small it is up on the top graph. If instead I turned it around and said, okay, people that are scoring in the top 2 deciles, in the top 20% of my score, if they're performing at 65% plus also, which they are, let me see where those distribute. And you can see there's just a lot more areas in the state we could go and compete. So bottom ground, Kane won that race, 52%, 46%. These are 7 counties who had been tied in the prior election in 2001 with Warner, and we won these counties, and we think it was largely, and not to take away from the rest of the campaign, but in these particular areas where we're targeting people within historically unfriendly areas, we seem to be able to move the needle significantly enough that we could tie and be competitive in those counties. So that's, another way to look at this is to say, let's say we actually say, so how does that translate into outreach? Well, this is the, think about this, a slightly variation of that voter map I showed you before, which had 3 positions. You could either end up in a voting Republican, voting Democrat, or not voting at all. This is based on the score. So here we're having actually continued value. So along your x-axis is how likely you are to be a Republican. Along your y-axis is how likely you are to turn out and vote. And so upper right-hand corner, highly Democratic, because you're part of the right, but low likely to turn out. Down at the bottom, highly likely to turn out, but conflicted in terms of your support. You're right in the middle. So this is the, in 2008, the Obama campaign. You can see it's slightly darker in the upper right-hand corner. So these were messages aimed at turning out strong supporters. That's the upper right-hand circle. And then down in the middle, we knew these people were going to vote. For some reason, they were hesitant to support Obama. We spent a lot of energy trying to convince them to vote. Now compare this to what it looked like in 2004. That was the way elections were fought before 2008. They just went to the people that were hardcore Democrats and just spent all their time and energy talking to those people. And so you can see on the right, it's a much more efficient allocation of resources than it is on the left, where you're talking to people who are going to turn out anyways, and then perhaps don't necessarily. And the last thing I want to touch on briefly is experimentation. So clinical trials is something that's been done in medicine and in marketing really for a long time, which is we want to isolate and measure the impact of treatment on individual voters. And this just wasn't possible before we had the voter files. We could measure sort of large-scale impact, so we could do a mailing to 100,000 people, then poll afterwards and see if we moved the dial. But we don't know who it was impacting and all that type of stuff. But by doing individual clinical trials, keeping track of individual voters, talking to them before they were treated and talking to them afterwards, we can actually measure the impact. And what's interesting and what's cool about this is that once we know the impact of individual messages on individual voters, we can now refine and how our messages are, we can message allocated based on these, so we know. And so let me give you a real specific example. This was a clinical trial by the AFL-CIO in 2000. So they, you guys, okay? Are we still there?
Yes, we can still hear you.
Good. So basically the experiment went like this. We had a group, 2 populations identified identically on the voter file, so they had the same mixture of scores, same demographic mixture, same likelihood of turning out to vote. One group received a robocall, sort of telling them a certain, to be aware of the impact of outsourcing. They then sent a piece of mail and then followed up with a robocall. And they did some polling in those robocalls also. The whole issue was about the impact of outsourcing under Bush, George Bush. So what we saw is that they then measured the results based on these robocalls before and after. But they saw people that were treated using this mail piece were 74% likely to vote Democratic versus 69% if they were in our control group. So we went from a plus 38 benefit to a plus 48. So we can, we're almost, you can see the almost a 20% lift in terms of the, well, about 5% lift in the base Dem support, but overall you go from 38 up 38 to up 48. So a plus 10-point game in margin. But the most surprising thing about this, and the thing that was completely surprising, is everyone thought when we started this test that people that would be most concerned about outsourcing would be people that are in manufacturing. It's my job, the steel worker, the automotive worker, that's going to lose his job if due to outsourcing when things get sent overseas. This is the whole, a lot of the basis for the, Donald Trump campaign argument. But what we found is the biggest lift came from builders. And when we talked to people afterwards, we realized that it just wasn't on their radar. So people that were in manufacturing had already been very well aware of the whole issue of outsourcing, so that when we talked to them about it through a direct mail piece, it didn't move the needle. They were already taking that information that had already been processed. Their decisions had already had that baked in. But when we talked to this about building trades, all of a sudden they realized their fellow union members were getting hurt on an issue that they had never even thought about because they're in building. Those don't get outsourced. So not only did we find out that it moved, but we also found out what segments it moved the most on, so we could spend a lot of our resources mailing to these particular trade unions rather than to all the trade unions. So how does that translate? Well, it was a $1.5 million program. So if we did a single message to a large segment, the average price to move a vote is about $10 for this particular. So we would move about 147,000 votes with that 1.5 million. But because we now had a specific message we knew was resonating with a specific target, the cost to move that vote drops to $450. And now using the same budget, we can move double that, nearly 333,000 plus. So that's how experimentation combines with the targeting and combines with the experimentation to really increase your yield in a campaign. So what's new this year? Well, there are clearly signs that we're in sort of uncharted territory here in many ways. But the things that I've seen is that there's definitely more extensive use of digital. They're going to break $1 billion level this year for the first time, but it's still only 9% of the budget. So the majority is still going to go on TV. Now there is some differences. They're going to start being able to target TV ads. There's some products like Comcast and other where pretty soon your neighbor who may be watching the exact same TV show is going to start getting different ads than you are. That's being tested out. The other thing that's different is, I talked to you about the way we tested the impact of direct mail through experimental design. There's a lot of use now around using YouTube to do ad testing. So now they can actually run video roll before YouTube and look at the impact and follow it up with polling or other metrics to measure the impact. And then there's this other area around behavioral science. You may have heard Ted Cruz was using a company called Cambridge Analytica. And instead of sort of focusing around specific turnout, support, or even issues, they're trying to focus around state of mind. Are you angry? Do you feel like you've been passed up? Do you think you've been unjustly treated or whatever? And then you can start to have a communication around that, which is not necessarily issue specific. Also, the other area around behavioral sciences is around turnout. So, for example, in turnout, we used to try to say it's your patriotic duty to show up and vote. That has a little bit of an impact. Or we try to shame people, saying, your vote's really important. So if you had voted last time, maybe we wouldn't have lost. Ends up none of that worked really well. What really worked well is they've done mailers where they basically tell you how you vote as compared to your neighbors. So you voted 2 of the last 4 elections, but your immediate neighbors have voted 3 out of the last 4. Believe it or not, that has a huge impact. That sort of peer pressure. And so, again, behavioral science, figuring out what's the best way to nudge somebody to take a behavior, which may not necessarily be around a specific issue, which is what was our focus in the past. So that is my monologue, and I'd love to open it up to questions.
So at this time, if you have a question, you can type it into the box there on your screen or raise your hand, and we can give you control to ask your question.
Nah, could have been that clear. I'm sure there's some questions out there.
I do have a question here. Have you ever used these techniques for recalls or other measures not between two candidates?
Great question. We use them for ballot initiatives quite a bit. Matter of fact, one of my favorite campaigns was Minnesota had a ballot initiative, and they were trying to increase sales tax by, I think it was 3/8 of a cent to acquire additional green space. And it's a tax increase, so the traditional approach would be to break down partisan lines. The assumption would be the Republicans would be against it because it's a tax increase, and Democrats would be for it. But what we did is we went out and identified and modeled hunters and fishermen. So we ended up having a message that cut across partisanship lines, and we ended up, it was actually in 2008, this ballot initiative, we ended up getting more votes than Obama did in that particular route in Minnesota, because we had somehow built a coalition by appealing to an issue that cut across partisanship lines. And we milled a model so we could find those people pretty easily. And part of that model used things like hunting licenses and fishermen's licenses. I have not seen it used in a recall though, but I would not be surprised if it has been done.
Great. Second question. Hi, Dr. Yuhas. For these models for who to target, do you only use your own polls or do you combine other polls? A follow-up, I guess, for a larger question, how do you handle information from a large mass of polls?
That's a good question. So from the specifics of building a model, you need to control the polling process, because what I need to know is I'm pulling the voter sample from a voter file. So I'm trying, and the reason I need to know who it is I'm talking to is I need to match up to all that other demographic information. So people can give me poll results from other polls. If I have the raw data and they give me some information, like if I have phone number, age, and gender, I can take that polling data and match it up to a voter file. But if it's just the aggregate data, or if it's information I can't match to a voter file, it's of less use to me.
Great. And another question, Dr. Yuhas, I'm very interested in a career path similar to yours. Do you think a master's or PhD are needed?
I don't definitely not a PhD. Master's might be useful, but I think really, and what's great about this field is in an election year like this, there's a huge demand for it. Now bad news is you don't tend not to get paid very well in these campaigns, but you can get experience real easily. Really, what's important is to have a set of tools that you can use. A large what I've seen mostly over the last couple of years is R is pretty ubiquitous. So to be able to build models in R is a skill set that would probably get you a position at one of many campaigns, and there's also a lot of firms that will take people on as interns. But I don't think statistics and experience with tools like R is sufficient to get started, and definitely don't need to get a PhD. And masters may help you flesh out, but definitely not to get started. And feel free to, you have my information here, reach out to me if you want to talk about specific job opportunities.
Again, if you have a question, you can type it into your question box or raise your hand on the screen, and we can give you the ability to ask a question that way. Another question, does the data show that more voters will vote against their party than in other elections?
Good question. this is that's something I meant to bring up. It's a really good question. People, one thing we found, which is shocking to me to this day, is people are very poor at predicting whether they're going to vote. So we used to build these turnout models based on, we'd ask people in a survey, how likely are you to vote this fall? It was darn close to random. You know, if somebody says yes, they're going to vote this fall, and then you go back and you check their vote history after the election, it's terrible prediction. It's even bad when you ask them if they voted in the last election. I know when I talk to somebody if they voted in the last election because I can look at their vote history, and people often say yes or no. And you also see this with polling. If you ask the day after an election, who did you vote for, the margin of win tends to be much higher because people tend to want to be on the winning team and they'll say they voted for the winner. So all that is that we don't really know. That is somewhat the point I was trying to make early on. We don't know who's going to show up to vote. We know our models are really pretty good at predicting if you show up to vote, how you're going to vote. So, matter of fact, when I talked about the early vote when I worked in the Obama campaign in 2008, we every night could get a list of everybody that voted. We have their support score. We know the probability they're going to vote. So we could at any time say, currently in North Carolina, 300,000, this is made up data, 300,000 people voted, and we think that split right now is, 55% Obama, 45% Romney. And in fact, sometimes when we looked at that data, North Carolina, after the fact, they actually are one of the few ones that released early votes separately. Our numbers were dead on. What we don't know is who's going to show up. So the big question here is, is who's going to show up. And I think we don't believe what people tell us. One of the things people use as a proxy for that is enthusiasm. So how enthusiastic are you about the candidate? Higher enthusiasm, the much likelihood of turnout. I think that's actually one of the most interesting changes in the dynamics of this race in the last week. If you look at the enthusiasm gap, it's really changed a lot. Before the tape came out, Trump supporters were much more enthusiastic than Clinton supporters, and that's no longer the case. At least some of the polling I've seen, it's much closer. So anyway.
Great. More questions about job searching. What are your thoughts on decent internships? Should they be only in campaigns, or can they be in other types of organizations using large data?
Oh, I think either's fine. I think campaigns on election years like this, but unfortunately they're only every 2 years. There's a lot more slots, so it might be easier to get your foot in the door. But I personally think experience in any area with predictive modeling is going to be, you're going to have a great tool set they'll be thrilled to get you. And it's also a much more viable long-term path. I mean, the thing about this political stuff is, come November 8th, there's going to be a lot of good modelers with no work, and so it's a lot of fun, but it's a tough road to hoe.
Beyond modeling skills, how important are soft skills to your work? Things like teamwork, writing oral communications, etc., critical thinking.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. So technical skill is important, but at the end of the day, you have to be able to communicate what you find. So being able to summarize and communicate clearly is the second most important. And it's also makes your job and your career much more interesting. I've seen some extremely talented mathematicians that work on some of these problems, but because of the limitations in their communication skills or shyness or something, they never get to present it, or they choose not to present it, and they never get credit. And they don't, as from a career perspective, they don't move as quickly as they should, given the talent they have. So I think working on your communication skills is extremely important. I mean, obviously, it's important in any job to be able to work with others, play well with others, but it's politics, so playing well with others isn't all that valued. but it's a lot of fun. You are personality-wise, and when you work on a campaign, it's really long hours, and you tend to be in really close quarters. So you do want to be able to get along with other people.
Great. And then last question, any other suggestions for fields or organizations that use predictive modeling?
It's amazing. When I started off in predictive modeling, I worked in financial services because that's where the data was. Credit bureau data was really available, and all of them use it. But now it's ubiquitous. Every marketing organization uses that, and I was just looking at, there's a website, Indeed, which is job prospects, and I just typed in data science, and it's everywhere now. It's in every, so if you could almost pick an area you're interested in, and I can guarantee you there's probably a data component there. So it used to be, I would go where the data science was, but I think you can now flip it around and say, if I'm really interested in anything. There's a lot of work, really interesting work in social good. So there's a program out in Chicago I worked at 2 summers ago, Data Science for Social Good. It's funded by Eric Schmidt of Google. And they work on problems like, predicting what are the drivers causing higher maternal mortality in Mexico, or what are the key attributes that predicts whether a 5th grader in Montgomery County is going to graduate on time. And what they use those for is like to allocate resources to do some early interventions. Or another problem was, what home, you need to identify lead paint in a city. Right now there's a 10-year backlog for inspections. Can we build a model that predicts which house is most likely to have lead paint? And oh, by the way, which house most likely to have a school-aged child, so that we will prevent that kid from getting lead poisoning. So there's a lot of interesting work in data science and predictive modeling, and I'd be happy if you have individual interests, reach out to me, and I'll try to find somebody that, an organization that does what you're interested in.
And last question, maybe. Do you see an increase in international organizations or parties that request services from organizations like yours?
That's a great question. I've done, most of my international work has been on the commercial side. I've done work for like EMI Records and SHA Publishing and stuff. So I've done some commercial stuff. Not as much political. There are some groups that I know that have been working in Chile. I know one of the big differences is that my understanding is there's a much more restrictions on data in places like Europe. So I don't think they have open source voter files. There's a lot of restrictions on how commercial data can be used. I don't know the specifics of individual countries, but my understanding, that's what's really kept this from growing significantly in some parts of the world.
Great. If there are any other questions, we maybe have time for one more.
Well, if you guys think of one after you email me, and I'd be happy to talk to anybody if they're interested in this career.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for your time today. It was great insight and great information, and we certainly appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.